Senator from Vermont.
I enjoyed the remarks from my friend from Missouri. Unfortunately, I can't quite agree with the thrust of his statement. In my view, the current trade policies in this country are a disaster. The evidence is very clear that they have cost us many millions of jobs. And to continue that same unfettered free trade philosophy in terms of trade agreements with Korea, Panama, and Colombia makes absolutely no sense at all. When you have a policy that is failing, you change it, you don't continue it. Madam President, let us be very clear, as I think most Americans understand. Our economy today is in a disastrous shape. Our middle class is disappearing. Recent statistics told us that poverty levels are at an all-time high, and the gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider. And in my view, one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for the collapse of the middle class has to do with the loss of millions of good manufacturing jobs attributable to these disastrous trade policies. And if we are serious as a nation in wanting to rebuild the middle class, lower our poverty rates, what we have got to do is move forward in a new direction in trade based on fair trade principles and end this unfettered free trade, which has been such a disaster for American workers. Madam President, over the last decade, we as a nation have lost 50,000 manufacturing plants in our country. I want to repeat that because that is such a staggering number that it needs to be said over and over again. 50,000 manufacturing plants in this country have shut down over the last 10 years alone. We have lost during that same period 5.5 million factory jobs, and many of those jobs are good-paying jobs. They are jobs that provided people with good wages and good benefits. Those jobs are gone, and in many cases have been replaced by Walmart, McDonald-type jobs, low wages, minimal benefits. Madam President, to give you an extent about how significant the decline in manufacturing in this country is, the reality is that in 1970, 25% of all jobs in the United States were manufacturing jobs, and today that number is just 9%. 9%. In July of 2000, there were 17.3 million manufacturing workers in this country. Today, there are only 11 million manufacturing workers. In my small state of Vermont, Vermont is not Ohio, it's not Michigan, it has never been one of the great manufacturing centers in the country. But even in a small state like Vermont, what we have seen is a huge decline in good-paying manufacturing jobs, which has certainly impacted our middle class. 10 years ago, we had approximately 45,000 manufacturing jobs in Vermont. Last year, we had 31,000 manufacturing jobs. We've lost about a third of our manufacturing jobs. And I should tell you, Mr. President, that 7,800 of those jobs were lost as a result of the trade agreement with China, and another 1,300 were lost as a result of NAFTA. The key issue here today, Mr. President, is whether we continue our disastrous trade policy, which includes NAFTA, permanent normal trade relations with China, and CAFTA. Do we add on to trade policies which have failed? And for the love of me, I cannot understand why anybody would want to do that. And the facts are very clear. Our current trade policies have failed, have been a disaster for working families. Mr. President, according to a recent study conducted by the well-respected economist at the Economic Policy Institute, the PNTR, permanent normal trade relations with China, has led to the loss of 2.8 million American jobs. 2.8 million American jobs. And I remember, because I was in the House when that debate took place, and I heard the same thing then as I hear now. Members of Congress getting up and talking about all of the new jobs that were going to be created. Well, it wasn't true then. It is not true now. How can you defend a trade policy based on the same principles as PNTR with China when that policy has cost us 2.8 million jobs in the last year alone? And then we got NAFTA. Many of us remember all the rhetoric around NAFTA. My goodness, we're going to open up the entire Mexican economy for products made in the United States of America. We're going to be selling it in Mexico. Does anybody in America believe that that policy has worked, that NAFTA has worked? The facts are very clear. Again, according to the EPI, they found that NAFTA has led to the loss of 680,000 jobs. So the simple reality is, you don't have to be a PhD in economics to figure out that if a company has the option of hiring somebody in a low-wage country at 50 cents an hour, 70 cents an hour, don't have to deal with unions, don't have to deal with environmental standards, why would you not go to those countries? Well, the answer is you would go. The answer is they have gone. And that's what these trade policies are about. Not selling American-produced products abroad, but creating a situation where companies can shut down in America, move factories abroad, and bring those products back into this country tariff-free. Now, Mr. President, we have quote after quote after quote from members of Congress who got up on the floor during the NAFTA debate, during the China debate, and they told us about all the jobs that were going to be created. And it is astounding to me that I keep hearing that rhetoric when, in fact, nothing said in the past has proven to be true. Let me just quote my good friends, that's in quotes, they're not really good friends, from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And they tell us, U.S. Chamber of Commerce tells us, and I quote, this is the discussion about Korea, Panama, and Colombia. This is foremost the debate about jobs. At a time when millions of Americans are out of work, these agreements will create real business opportunities that could generate hundreds of thousands of new jobs, end of quote. That's the Chamber of Commerce. But wait a second. Is this the same Chamber of Commerce that on July 1st, 2004, according to the Associated Press, said, and here's the headline on that article, Chamber of Commerce leader advocates offshoring of jobs, end of quote. And here's what the article stated about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who is such a strong advocate for these trade policies. Quote, U.S. Chamber of Commerce President and CEO Thomas Donahue urged American companies to send jobs overseas as a way to boost American competitiveness. Donahue said that exporting high-paid tech jobs to low-cost countries such as India, China, and Russia saves companies money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's see. Chamber of Commerce is leading the effort for these trade agreements, but their leadership tells us that outsourcing of jobs is a good thing. Maybe you might want to think twice before you accepted the advice of the Chamber of Commerce. Mr. President, the United States Department of Commerce has reported, and this is really very interesting, not only as information unto itself, but about the politics of this whole trade agreement. You got the Chamber of Commerce, you got every major multinational corporation in the country telling us how good this unfettered free trade policy is. But now we have the U.S. Department of Commerce has reported that over the last decade, U.S. multinational corporations slashed 2.9 million American jobs. All right, let's digest that. Large corporations, the multinationals come in here and they tell us, oh, these trade agreements are great, they're going to create American jobs, but at the same time, over the last decade, they have slashed 2.9 million American jobs. But here is the other side of the story. The truth is that these same multinational corporations who are telling members of Congress to vote for these trade agreements, the truth is they are creating jobs. The only problem is the jobs they are creating are not in the United States of America. They are in China and other low-wage countries. Over this last same period, over this last decade, while they laid off 2.9 million American workers, these same multinational corporations created 2.4 million new jobs abroad. Lay off 2.9 million American workers, create 2.4 million jobs in China and other low-wage countries. And that, in a nutshell, is what these trade agreements are about: enabling corporations to shut down in America, move to low-wage countries, and bring their products back into our country. And the results are very clear. The results are very clear. You don't need a great study done by the Department of Commerce or the Economic Policy Institute. All you have to do today is walk into any department store in America, and when you buy a product, you know where that product is manufactured. It's not manufactured in Vermont. It's not manufactured in California. It is, as often as not, manufactured in China, Mexico, or other developing countries. That has been the whole goal of these trade agreements: shut down plants in America, move them abroad, hire low-wage workers there, bring the products into this country. And the idea that we would be extending this concept to Korea, Panama, and Colombia makes no sense to me at all. Mr. President, since the year 2000, 2.8 million American jobs have been eliminated or displaced as a result of the increased trade deficit with China. And after all of the talk on the floor of the Senate and on the floor of the House and the editorial boards of major newspapers, and by leading politicians about how the China trade agreement would create jobs in America, it is very interesting to hear what these corporations had to say a few years after the trade agreement was passed. In other words, before it is passed, they will tell you about how we're going to create all these jobs in America. Day after it's passed, their line changes. China Free Trade Agreement was passed at around the year 2000. A couple of years later, Jeffrey Immelt, the CEO of General Electric, was quoted on this subject at an investor meeting just 1 year after China was admitted to the World Trade Organization. All right? This is after China, the Chinese-American Free Trade Agreement. This is what Mr. Immelt said, and I quote, "When I am talking to GE managers, I talk China, 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 China." That's him, not me. 5 Chinas. "You need to be there. You need to change the way people talk about it and how they get there. I am a nut on China. Outsourcing from China is going to grow to $5 billion. We are building a tech center in China. Every discussion today has the center on China. The cost basis is extremely attractive. You can take an 18 cubic foot refrigerator, make it in China, land it in the United States, and land it for less than we can make an 18 cubic foot refrigerator today ourselves." This is the head of General Electric, who, by the way, I guess is President Obama's great advisor in creating jobs in America, 2 years after the China agreement was signed. And on it goes. It's not just Mr. Immelt. It is major corporation after major corporation. Before the agreement, its jobs were great in America. After the agreement, it's all of the advantages of outsourcing. And let me tell you how bad the situation is. And I think most Americans know that not only it is a disaster for our economy that we're not producing the products we consume, but it is really an embarrassment. And I'll give you an example. Mr. President, last year, the holiday season, I walked into the Smithsonian Museum's very beautiful American History Museum. It's a great museum, and I urge everybody in Washington, come to Washington to visit. I walked into the gift shop of the Smithsonian Museum, owned by the people of America, paid for by the people of America. You know what their gift shop had? Most of the products in the gift shop were not made in America. Turns out they were made in China, made in other countries, low-wage countries around the world. I went to a section where they had little busts of presidents of the United States, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Barack Obama. You turn it up. You know where these busts of presidents of the United States were made? Yeah, you guessed it, in China. Well, we have since been having some discussions with the Smithsonian. They're in the process of changing their policies. We're working with other people as well. But that's how bad the situation is, that busts of American presidents made in a museum owned by the people of the United States of America, talking about the history and culture of America, are made in China. That's just one example of how pathetic this whole situation is. And on it goes. And by the way, Mr. President, when we talk about trade, we often focus on blue-collar jobs, on manufacturing jobs, but it is also increasingly information technology jobs and white-collar jobs. You know, and just think for a moment, Mr. President, that during the past 4 years, the cumulative trade deficit with China in advanced technology, I'm not talking about sneakers, advanced technology products total more than $300 billion. Last year, our trade deficit with China on advanced technology products was a staggering $92 billion in 1 year alone. I just bought one of these very nice iPhones. It is very, very nice. You know where that product is made? It's made in China. And the iPad is made in China, and the iPod, and the BlackBerry, and IBM computers, and Dell computers, and Microsoft Xbox, and big screen TVs. None of these American inventions. We pride ourselves. Steve Jobs recently passed away. Great business person. But we pride ourselves on developing these technologies, but where are they made? More often than not, they are made in China. According to a December 15, 2010 article in the Wall Street Journal, quote, one widely touted solution for current U.S. economic woes is for America to come up with more of the high-tech gadgets that the rest of the world craves. Yet two academic researchers estimate that Apple's iPhone, one of the best-selling U.S. technology products, actually added $1.9 billion to the U.S. trade deficit with China last year. So we develop these products, but we can't manufacture them here because these companies prefer low wages in China. And on it goes. Not just blue-collar, white-collar jobs as well. Mr. President, and today, we're not talking about China, we're not talking about Mexico, we're talking about Korea, we're talking about Panama, we're talking about Colombia. But it's the same old story. Chamber of Commerce is back again, creating all of these jobs till the day after the agreement is signed, and then going to be talking about how they can throw American workers out on the street. And, you know, it's interesting, Mr. President. Poll after poll shows that, to say the least, the American people do not have an enormous amount of respect for the United States Congress and see Congress living in a very different world than working-class people are living in. And I don't know of any example where that schizophrenia is greater than in terms of trade. You go back home, I don't know what it's like in Rhode Island, tell you what it's like in Vermont. You ask people, well, what do you think about these trade agreements with China? Do you think they're creating jobs in America? And people say, are you nuts? Of course they're not. Everybody knows that. And the polls tell us that. In September 2010, an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 69% of Americans believe that, quote, free trade between the United States and other countries costs the U.S. jobs, end of quote. I think every group in America except the United States Congress seems to get that point. But then again, the United States Congress is surrounded by lobbyists and campaign contributors that come from big money interests, and they like these unfettered free trade agreements. In terms of Korea, let me say a word about the Korean agreement. Economic Policy Institute has estimated that the Korean free trade agreement will lead to the loss of 159,000 American jobs and will increase the trade deficit by nearly $14 billion over a 7-year period. Why do you want to go forward in a trade agreement that will cost you jobs? Now, President Obama has estimated that the Korea Free Trade Agreement will, quote, support at least 70,000 American jobs, end quote, but the headline of a December 7, 2010 article in the New York Times says it all, quote, few new jobs expected soon from free trade agreement with South Korea. According to this article, the Korean Free Trade Agreement is likely to result in little, if any, net job creation in the short run, according to the government's own analysis, our government's own analysis. This analysis was done by the U.S. International Trade Commission, which projects that our overall trade deficit will increase, not decrease, if Korea Free Trade is implemented. This is our own International Trade Commission. What are we doing? What are we doing? Now, Mr. President, let me just touch on one aspect of the Korea Free Trade Agreement which deserves a lot of focus, and I fear very much that it's not. And that is that the Korean Free Trade Agreement will force American workers not just to compete against low-wage workers in South Korea, but also to compete against the virtual slave labor conditions that exist in North Korea, a country which is certainly one of the most undemocratic countries in the world. And to add insult to injury, not only are our workers going to be competing against slave labor in North Korea, some of the proceeds from this free trade will go to the dictatorship of Kim Jong-il, certainly one of the more vicious dictators in the entire world. And what that is about, Mr. President, is that a number of companies in South Korea, including Hyundai and many others, own companies that are doing business in a large industrial area in North Korea. And what this agreement will allow is products made in North Korea to go to South Korea and then come back into the United States of America. And I know there's been a little bit of confusion on this, but there shouldn't be. According to a January 2011 report from the Congressional Research Service, quote, I hope everybody who plans on voting for this free trade agreement with Korea hears this, quote, this is CRS, there is nothing to prevent South Korean firms from performing intermediate manufacturing operations in North Korea and then performing final manufacturing processes in South Korea. For example, as much as 65% of the value of a South Korean car coming into the United States could actually be made in North Korea if this trade agreement goes into effect. And today we have over 47,000 North Korean workers are currently employed by more than 120 South Korean firms, including Hyundai, at the casing industrial complex in North Korea. What an agreement. What an agreement. Slave labor in North Korea, manufacturing products which go to South Korea and then come into the United States of America. And meanwhile, the dictatorship of North Korea gets a piece of the action, a significant piece of the action on top of the pennies an hour that the North Korean workers get. In 2007, Han Duck-soo, who was then the Prime Minister of South Korea and is now the current South Korean ambassador to the United States, said, and I quote, Ambassador to the United States said, the planned ratification of the South Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement will pave the way for the export of products built in Kaesong, North Korea, to the U.S. market, end of quote. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? Bad enough for workers in our country to have to compete against people in China and in Vietnam, people are making 20, 30 cents an hour, 40 cents an hour. Now we're asked to compete against slave labor in North Korea. And that's the treaty that people will be voting for today. Mr. President, I think a lot of folks have mentioned, in terms of Colombia, the assault on trade unionists there. Since 1986, some 2,800 trade unionists have been assassinated. Less than 6% of these murders have been prosecuted by the Colombian government. And last year alone, in a small country, More than 50 trade unionists were assassinated in Colombia, up 9% from 2009. Now, I would ask you, Mr. President, if in Colombia 50 CEOs of companies were killed last year, were murdered last year, do you think that people here would be voting for a free trade agreement with Colombia? Or would they say, why would we want an agreement with a country which is so unlawful, which is so brutal, where so many CEOs are being killed? But it's not CEOs, it's just trade union leaders. So I guess it is okay to have an agreement there. I would also tell you, Mr. President, that President Obama had a different view on Colombia when he was a candidate for president in 2008. In October of 2008, candidate Barack Obama said that, quote, "The history in Colombia right now is that labor leaders have been targeted for assassination on a fairly consistent basis, and there have not been prosecutions," end of quote. Candidate Obama in 2008 was right to oppose this trade agreement. Unfortunately, as president, he is wrong to support it right now. Let me say a word about the Panama Free Trade Agreement. Now, Panama is a very small country. Its entire annual economic output is only $26.7 billion a year, or about 0.2% of the American economy. So I think no one is going to legitimately stand up here and say that trading with such a small country is going to significantly increase American jobs. Then why would we? Why would we be considering a trade agreement with Panama? What's going on there? Well, it turns out, Mr. President, that Panama is a world leader when it comes to allowing wealthy Americans and large corporations to evade U.S. taxes by stashing their cash in offshore tax havens. And the Panama Free Trade Agreement would make this bad situation much worse. As I'm a member of the Budget Committee, as you are, Mr. President, and we have heard testimony time and time again that our country is losing up to $100 billion every year as corporations stash their money in postal addresses in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and in Panama. And this trade agreement makes that situation even worse. According to Citizens for Tax Justice, quote, "A tax haven has one of three characteristics. It has no income tax or a very low-rate income tax. It has bank secrecy laws, and it has a history of non-cooperation with other countries on exchanging information about tax matters. Panama has all three of those, and they are probably the worst," end of quote, according to Citizens for Tax Justice. The trade agreement with Panama would effectively bar the United States from cracking down on illegal and abusive offshore tax havens in Panama. In fact, combating tax haven abuse in Panama would be a violation of this free trade agreement, exposing the U.S. to fines from international authorities. Well, at a time when we have a $14 trillion plus national debt, and at a time when we are frantically figuring out ways to try to lower our deficit, some of us believe that it is a good idea to do away with all of these tax havens by which the wealthy and large corporations stash their money abroad and avoid paying U.S. taxes. The Panama Trade Agreement would make that goal even more difficult. I want to say another word on issues that is, I think, important as we look into the future. The proposed Korea Free Trade Agreement threatens both the 340B drug program, which requires drug companies to provide discounts on covered outpatient drugs purchased by federally funded health providers, such as community health centers and other safety net providers, and the ability of Medicare Part B to hold down the prices of outpatient drugs. The Korean Free Trade Agreement would potentially allow Korean drug manufacturers to challenge the pricing under these programs on the grounds that the prices are not market-driven. In other words, forcing prices up in this country. And that is something that was pushed, by the way, by our trade representative, not theirs. In essence, the pharmaceutical industry's lobbyists, with complete indifference to the plight of millions of the most frail and vulnerable Americans, have succeeded in inserting provisions into the Korean trade agreement that would allow Korean companies to maximize their profits by challenging the cost control measures under the 340B and Medicare Part B programs. But unfortunately, Mr. President, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Right now, the pharmaceutical lobby, and they are a very, very powerful lobby, and the United States Trade Representative are negotiating a new trade agreement, the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, that I fear very much will make a bad situation in terms of drug access for the developing world, for poor people all over the world, much worse than it already is. Their aim, yet again, is to maximize drug company profits at the expense of the most vulnerable populations by tying the hands of health authorities here and in other developed and developing countries abroad who seek to provide access to low-cost, generic pharmaceutical drugs for their citizens. In negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, our government is actively pushing intellectual property laws for medicines that are more restrictive than we impose even here in the United States, with the effect of making it far more difficult to get generic drugs on the market in those countries. One of them, Vietnam, is a good example. Vietnam obviously is a very, very poor country. Vietnam has received more than $320 million from the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, created under President George W. Bush and continued under President Obama since 2004. The function of this program is to make sure that the poorest people in the world who have diseases like AIDS are able to get the drugs they need at a price they can afford to pay. And that means making generic treatments available. The PEPFAR program has actually had significant success. And as somebody who was not a great fan of President George W. Bush, this is an area where he actually did something quite positive. And that program is credited with saving millions of lives in 15 developing nations over the last 7 years. In the face of one of the most severe humanitarian crises in modern history, the United States put billions of dollars into doing something about it, and we are doing that today. So why, in the face of this success by one arm of our government, would another arm work to pull the rug out from underneath it? Yet that is what the U.S. Trade Representative's office is doing just now. So in other words, on one hand, what we're trying to do is the right thing, the humanitarian thing, and make sure that poor and sick people around the world are able to get the medicines that they desperately need to stay alive at a price they can afford to pay. And on the other hand, another part of the United States government is saying, wait a second, we got to protect the interests of the drug companies, make sure that they can make as much money as possible, that they can charge and force poor companies to pay outrageously high prices for drugs, even if that means that many, many people die because they can't afford those drugs. So this is a contradiction. This is what our new trade policies are about. I will be back on the floor at some point in the not-too-distant future to be talking about this very, very important issue. But let me just conclude, Mr. President, by saying this. This country is in the midst of the worst economic crisis since the 1930s. Middle class is disappearing. Poverty is increasing. Millions of Americans have seen a decline in their standard of living. The gap between the very rich and everybody else is growing wider. That is the reality of the American economy today. One of the reasons for the collapse of the middle class is the loss of millions and millions of good-paying manufacturing jobs. And one of the key reasons, not the only reason, but one of the key reasons that we are losing millions of manufacturing jobs are disastrous trade policies designed to allow American corporations to shut down here, move to low-wage countries, hire people there at pennies an hour, bring their products back. That is a policy, I suppose you can say, that has worked if you're the CEO of a large corporation. You make a lot more money paying people 50 cents an hour than $20 an hour. You make a lot more money working in a country where there are no environmental standards rather than a country where you have to have some standards protecting air and water. That's what our trade policy has been. And it seems to me to be enormously foolish for us to continue this failed policy of NAFTA, of CAFTA, of permanent normal trade relations with China, and extend them to Korea, Panama, and Colombia. I urge my colleagues to stand up to the big money interests who want us to pass these trade agreements, stand up for American workers, and say no. Trade is a good thing, but it has to be based on principles that protect ordinary Americans, working people, not just the CEOs of large corporations. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.